There are only 30 minutes left, and the strange thing is, the door that refused to move is beginning to shake. The narrator sees a person standing before that door again. The same person who has stood there so many times before. The same tired hand. The same unanswered questions. The same prayer whispered until the words almost lost their sound. They knocked when they were hopeful. They knocked when they were exhausted. They knocked when everybody told them to move on. And eventually, they began wondering whether anyone was listening on the other side. But on August 23rd, the atmosphere around that door changes, and Archangel Michael's message carries one urgent instruction. Do not confuse a delay with a denial, because something is moving where you cannot yet see it. Think about that one thing you have quietly wanted for longer than you admit. The opportunity that almost happened. The answer that seemed close and then disappeared. The conversation you hoped would change everything. The financial breakthrough, restored relationship, new beginning, purpose, peace, or direction you kept bringing before God. You watched other people receive what you were still praying for. You celebrated them while privately asking, Lord, when will it finally be my turn? That question matters now, because the narrator sees Michael standing at the threshold, not promising that every wish will suddenly appear exactly as imagined, but calling the listener to become spiritually awake. His sword catches the light. His wings stretch across the place where disappointment had been sitting. And his message is clear. You have spent so much time staring at the closed door that you have not noticed what God has been changing inside you while you waited. That is the mystery. What if the greatest evidence that the door is moving is not yet outside you? What if it began inside you? You are not praying exactly like you prayed before. You are not tolerating everything you tolerated before. You are beginning to recognize what drains you. You are learning that desperation and faith are not the same thing. You are becoming more careful about whose voice receives authority over your decisions. Something has already shifted. And now comes the question that makes August 23rd significant. What happens when the person who has spent so long asking for an open door finally becomes ready to walk through one? 30 minutes. Not 30 minutes to panic. Not 30 minutes to make reckless decisions. Not 30 minutes until God abandons you if you fail some hidden spiritual test. The urgency is deeper than that. It is the urgency of awakening. It is the realization that another season cannot be spent standing motionless before yesterday's disappointment. Remember the words of Revelation 3:8. See, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut. The narrator sees those words hovering over this moment like light. You thought the silence meant nothing was happening. You thought the delay meant you had been forgotten. You thought the closed door was proof that you were unqualified. But what if you were standing outside a room where preparation was still taking place? This is where Michael's warning becomes impossible to ignore, because the next part is not simply about the door opening. It is about why it remained closed for so long. There was something the waiting season had to reveal about your faith, your attachments, your expectations, and even the version of yourself that first began knocking. And when you understand that, the delay may suddenly look different. The narrator sees your hand approaching the door once more. But this time, you are not knocking like someone begging to be noticed. You are knocking like someone who has survived the hallway. Someone who learned to pray there. Someone who cried there and still got up. Someone who watched other doors close and nevertheless refused to believe that God had finished writing their story. Then comes the sound. Not thunder. Not shouting. Not some spectacular sign from the sky. Just a quiet click. A lock moose. And Michael stands beside the threshold as if to say, Pay attention now. The very place where you almost surrendered may become the place where you finally understand why you had to keep going. August 23rd is not being presented as permission to fear the clock. It is a reminder to stop sleeping through your own transformation. The 30 minutes symbolize something urgent. Your response to disappointment cannot remain the same. The door may be closer to opening than it appears. But before you reach for the handle, there is something you need to know about what happened while you were waiting on the other side. Because the closed door was never the whole story. Type "the door is opening" in the comments if you receive this message. Blessing number 2323. May it remind you to walk forward in faith, wisdom, and courage. The narrator sees you looking at that door again. But this time Archangel Michael is not directing your attention toward the handle. He is directing your attention toward the hallway behind you. Because before you understand why the door is beginning to open, you must understand why it remained closed for so long. And this may touch a place you rarely speak about. You prayed. You waited. You tried again. You watched opportunities appear close enough to touch, only to disappear without explanation. There were nights when you wondered whether you had misunderstood God completely. There were mornings when you woke with faith, only to end the day asking why nothing had changed. Perhaps the hardest part was watching someone else walk through a door that looked almost identical to the one you had been knocking on. You congratulated them, smiled for them, encouraged them, and then returned to your private place carrying a question nobody heard. God, what about me? Archangel Michael stands within that question and brings a different perspective. The closed door was not necessarily punishment. The delay was not proof that heaven had rejected you. Sometimes the person knocking is ready to receive something emotionally but is not yet prepared to carry everything that comes with it spiritually. You saw the opportunity. God saw the responsibility attached to the opportunity. You saw the blessing. God saw the pressure attached to the blessing. You saw what you wanted to enter. God saw what needed to develop inside you before entering it. This is why waiting can feel so confusing. From your side of the door, nothing appears to be happening. You hear no movement. You receive no explanation. Yet silence does not automatically mean absence. A seed beneath the soil makes no announcement while roots are forming, but hidden growth is still growth. Look at who you were when you first started knocking. Remember how desperately you needed certain people to approve of you. Remember how easily one rejection could destroy your confidence. Remember how quickly uncertainty could make you question your worth. Now look again. Something has changed. You have survived answers you did not want. You have endured seasons you never expected. You have learned that not every closed door deserves to be kicked down, and not every opportunity deserves your yes. You have discovered that discernment sometimes sounds like wait. You have learned that peace can be more valuable than immediate progress. The hallway was teaching you things the room beyond the door could never have taught you. This is why Michael's message carries both urgency and wisdom. You not become so excited about August 23rd that you forget what the waiting produced. The significance of this moment is not that a date magically guarantees whatever you desire. The deeper message is that you are being called to recognize how preparation can precede opportunity. Scripture repeatedly shows people experiencing waiting before moving. Joseph endured the prison before the palace. David knew the wilderness before the throne. Abraham lived through years between promise and fulfillment. Their waiting was painful, but waiting was not the conclusion of their stories. And neither should your present delay automatically be interpreted as the conclusion of yours. The narrator now sees Michael placing his hand against the door, and something unexpected becomes clear. You were asking God to change what was happening beyond the door while God was changing the person standing before it. That changes everything. Because if the door had opened when you first demanded it, perhaps you would have entered carrying fears that controlled you, relationships that drained you, habits that weakened you, or expectations that would have made the blessing unbearable. Perhaps you would have mistaken access for identity. Perhaps you would have depended upon the opportunity instead of God. Sometimes mercy looks strangely like delay because God cares about who you become, not merely what you obtain. And there is another reason this waiting hurt so deeply. You attached meaning to it. After enough disappointment, you stopped saying, "This door is closed," and started saying, "Something must be wrong with me." That is the lie Michael's sword cuts through now. A delayed opportunity does not determine your value. A person refusing you does not erase your calling. A season of silence does not make you invisible. You cannot measure God's love by the speed at which circumstances obey your preferred timeline. Your worth was never sitting behind that door. Now the narrator hears something from the other side. Footsteps. Movement. Reverberation. The sound is faint, but it is unmistakable. And suddenly the hallway that seemed like a prison begins to look like a training ground. The tears taught you compassion. The uncertainty taught you prayer. The rejection taught you boundaries. The loneliness taught you where your strength actually comes from. Even the moments you would never choose again became places where wisdom grew. So when that door moves, do not enter ashamed of how long you waited. Enter carrying what the waiting taught you. You are not approaching this threshold empty-handed. You are carrying endurance, discernment, humility, patience, and a faith that survived without constant evidence. And now Michael turns toward the door once more, because Section 3 reveals the mystery you could never see from the hallway. What was actually being prepared behind it while you kept knocking. Type "My waiting was not wasted" in the comments if you receive this message. Blessing number 2727. May it remind you that patience can produce wisdom, endurance, and courage for the door ahead. The narrator now sees Archangel Michael standing beside the door, but something has changed. Until this moment, you have been looking at the door from only one direction. You saw the handle that would not turn. You saw the prayers that seemed unanswered. You saw opportunities disappear and plans collapse. But Michael now draws your attention beyond the threshold, because while you were standing outside asking why nothing was happening, there were things developing beyond your sight. And this is where the mystery deepens. What if the silence you interpreted as inactivity was actually preparation? What if the answer was not absent but unfinished? What if some of the circumstances required for your next season were still being positioned while you were learning how to recognize them? You could not see any of that from the hallway. You could only see your side. You saw another rejection. You saw another month pass. You saw another conversation lead nowhere. You watched another possibility disappear and wondered why God would allow you to become hopeful if the outcome would remain uncertain. But the narrator sees Michael lifting his sword toward the darkness surrounding those memories, and suddenly another truth becomes visible. Some things were ending because they could not travel where you were going. Some connections were weakening because your dependence upon them had become greater than your dependence upon God. Some plans collapsed because you were trying to force an entrance through a door that looked attractive but could never provide the peace you were seeking. This is why Proverbs 3:5-6 carries such weight in this moment. Trust in the Lord rather than leaning entirely upon your own understanding, and He will direct your paths. Your understanding demanded an explanation. Faith required another posture. Faith said, "I cannot see what is happening, but I will not allow what I cannot see to convince me that nothing is happening." That is difficult when the waiting becomes personal. It is difficult when bills still arrive, loneliness still hurts, uncertainty still wakes you at night, and everyone around you seems to be moving faster. Yet this is precisely where endurance begins to become something deeper than positive thinking. It becomes trust without complete visibility. And Michael reveals something else. You were not the only thing being prepared. Circumstances had to change. Certain conversations had to happen without you. Certain opportunities had to mature. Certain relationships had to reveal their true character. Certain distractions had to lose their grip. The timing you wanted would have placed you inside a situation before you possessed the discernment to navigate it. Now you see more clearly. You notice motives you once ignored. You recognize peace differently. You no longer call every exciting possibility a blessing. You are learning that an open door is valuable only when you have the wisdom to know whether you should walk through it. The narrator watches Michael move closer to the threshold. There is light underneath the door now. Not enough to reveal everything, but enough to prove that darkness is not the only thing waiting beyond it. This is where your curiosity must become discernment. Do not attempt to predict every detail. Do not manufacture signs. Do not force ordinary events into dramatic interpretations. Instead, become attentive. Pray. Listen. Observe. Let August 23rd remind you that faith can remain awake without becoming afraid. The 30-minute urgency is not calling you into panic. It is calling you out of spiritual numbness. Something within you must become ready to respond when genuine opportunity appears. Perhaps the most powerful preparation happened in the place you resisted most, your identity. You once believed the opening of this door would prove that you were worthy. Now you are learning that your worth cannot depend upon whether the door opens. That difference is enormous. The person who needs an opportunity to prove their value can become enslaved to it. The person who already knows their value can enter with humility, gratitude, and freedom. This may be why you feel different now. You still desire the breakthrough, but you are beginning to understand that the breakthrough does not define you. Then the narrator hears Michael speak with unmistakable authority. Do not curse the hallway that taught you how to recognize the right door. Suddenly, the years behind you begin connecting differently. The disappointments were real. The pain was real. The unanswered questions were real. Yet none of them have to become wasted chapters. God can bring wisdom from what wounded you and courage from what frightened you. Romans 8:28 reminds believers that God works through all things for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. Even now, what once looked scattered may be forming a pattern you could not recognize while standing inside it. And now the light beneath the door grows brighter. The next revelation will take you back to the first knock, the prayer you almost forgot, the request you whispered when nobody else knew what you needed, and the moment you wondered whether heaven heard you at all. Type "I trust God" in the waiting in the comments if you receive this message. Blessing number 3131. May it remind you to meet every new door with discernment, courage, and faith. And if this message has become light for you while you stand before your own door, remember that somewhere another soul is still standing in a dark hallway, praying for encouragement. When you support this mission, you help carry that light farther, planting a seed so another person can encounter God's word when they desperately need hope. Scripture declares that the one who sows generously will also reap generously, and your giving can become part of that living harvest. Let your heart say, "I will help this light reach one more soul." If you feel called to participate, the PayPal donation link is available in every video description, and the PayPal QR code appears in the bottom right corner of every video. Let your gift become an act of generosity rather than fear or pressure. And may God bless every willing giver with wisdom, peace, and provision. So where your heart leads you, and help keep the door of encouragement open for someone who may be one message away from choosing hope. The narrator sees Archangel Michael turn away from the opening door for a moment and look backward, toward something you almost forgot. It is not another door. It is not another opportunity. It is the memory of your first knock. Before disappointment complicated your faith, before waiting exhausted your confidence, there was a moment when you simply asked God for help. Maybe it happened beside your bed when everyone else was asleep. Maybe it happened inside a parked car after you had held yourself together all day. Maybe you whispered it while staring at a ceiling because you had reached the end of your own answers. Nobody applauded that prayer. Nobody even knew you prayed it. But you remember the feeling behind it. You were not asking for luxury. You were asking for movement. You were asking God to show you that the story was not finished. And time passed. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. For some of you, months became years. The prayer that once burned brightly became quieter because repeating the same request began to hurt. You started protecting yourself from disappointment by expecting less. You told yourself you were being realistic, but beneath that realism lived a wounded question. Was I ever heard? And this is where Michael's message reaches directly into the waiting. Heaven did not require your prayer to be eloquent before it mattered. God did not need perfect sentences to understand your heart. Psalm 34:17 declares that the righteous cry out and the Lord hears them. Hearing does not always mean immediate fulfillment, but it means your cries are not meaningless. The narrator sees those old prayers differently now. They are not abandoned words scattered across forgotten nights. They became part of the journey that shaped your relationship with God. Some prayers changed circumstances. Others chained you. Some answers came quickly. Others arrived in forms you did not recognize until much later. And some questions remain unresolved even now. Yet Michael stands beside that history as a reminder that faith is not measured only by receiving exactly what was requested. Sometimes faith becomes most visible when a person continues seeking God after the outcome refuses to follow the schedule they expected. Remember Matthew 7:7. Ask, and it will be given. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open. Those words are not an invitation to manipulate God through persistence. They are an invitation into relationship, trust, and continued seeking. The knock matters because it represents a heart that refuses to surrender its conversation with heaven. You knocked when you understood. You knocked when you did not. You knocked with confidence, then later with tears. Sometimes your knock was nothing more than waking up and choosing to believe that tomorrow could still contain goodness. And perhaps that is why this moment feels different. The narrator sees Michael returning to the threshold, and this time there are marks upon the door. Every mark represents persistence. Every mark tells the story of another moment when you could have walked away permanently but chose to remain open to God. You thought nothing was changing because the door remained closed, yet something was being written into your character with every knock. Patience was growing where impulsiveness once ruled. Discernment was developing where desperation once made decisions. Humility was replacing the need to control every outcome. But Michael brings a warning with the encouragement. Do not turn August 23rd into superstition. Do not stare at a clock believing God's goodness expires when 30 minutes disappear. The urgency of this message is spiritual, not magical. The door represents the opportunities, healing, wisdom, and new beginnings you have sought. The 30 minutes represent the seriousness of becoming awake to what God may be teaching you now. You are being called to respond with faith rather than panic, attention rather than obsession, prayer rather than fear. There is something powerful about realizing that you can knock again without becoming the person you were before. This time, you do not need to bargain with God. You do not need to promise impossible things just to earn an answer. You do not need to interpret every delay as punishment. You can simply stand before God honestly and say, I still desire this, but I trust you more than I trust my preferred outcome. That prayer carries maturity. It releases the handle from your desperate grip while keeping your heart open. The narrator now sees your hand touching the door. And before you knock again, Michael asks one question that changes the atmosphere completely. If this door opens, are you willing to enter without carrying everything from the hallway with you? Because some things helped you survive the waiting but cannot accompany you into what comes next. Suspicion cannot become your permanent armor. Bitterness cannot become your identity. Fear cannot become your counselor. The memory of rejection cannot be allowed to speak louder than wisdom when a genuine opportunity finally appears. The knock heaven never forgot has brought you to a deeper threshold. You began by asking for an open door, but the journey has become about becoming someone capable of walking through it without losing peace, humility, or discernment. And that leads directly to what Michael reveals next. Before the threshold opens completely, there are things you must be willing to leave behind. Type I will knock in faith in the comments if you receive this message. Blessing number 4141. May it remind you that persistent prayer can remain peaceful, courageous, and surrendered to God. The narrator sees Archangel Michael standing directly between you and the threshold now, and for the first time, he does not immediately invite you forward. Instead, his attention falls upon what you are carrying. The door you prayed about is closer than before. Light is visible around its edges. The handle no longer appears frozen. Yet Michael's message becomes unexpectedly serious. Before you enter, look at what is still in your hands. Because sometimes the greatest obstacle to entering a new season is not a locked door. Sometimes it is our determination to drag yesterday through tomorrow's entrance. You asked God for something new, but new beginnings require space. And there are burdens you learned to carry so faithfully that you almost forgot they were burdens. You have carried disappointment long enough for it to become familiar. You have carried conversations that ended years ago but continue inside your mind. You have carried rejection until you begin expecting rejection from people who never rejected you. You have carried the memory of doors slammed in your face until every approaching opportunity started looking suspicious. The narrator sees Michael raising his sword, but the sword is not pointed toward another person. It represents discernment. It separates truth from fear, wisdom from resentment, memory from identity. And this is the question confronting you now. Can you remember what happened without allowing what happened to control what happens next? That is harder than it sounds. When you have waited a long time, self-protection can begin masquerading as wisdom. You tell yourself you no longer care because caring became painful. You stop expecting good things because disappointment feels safer when expectations are low. You distance yourself before others have the opportunity to leave. You reject possibility before possibilities can reject you. Eventually, the locked door is no longer outside you. Another one forms inside your heart. And Michael's message carries urgency because an external door can open while an internal door remains sealed. This is why Isaiah 43 carries such power into this moment. Forget the former things. You not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. This does not mean pretending your past never happened. Healing is not denial. Wisdom does not require amnesia. The invitation is to stop allowing yesterday to possess authority over tomorrow. God can teach you through the past without imprisoning you inside it. You can honor what you learned without repeatedly reliving what wounded you. You can forgive without returning to unhealthy situations. You can establish boundaries without becoming bitter. You can move forward without pretending everything behind you was acceptable. The narrator now sees several things lying at your feet before the threshold: an old expectation, an outdated identity, a fear you inherited from disappointment, and the exhausting need to understand why everything happened. That final burden may be the heaviest. You wanted explanations. You wanted people to admit what they did. You wanted circumstances to make sense before you moved forward. But some doors will open before every question receives an answer. If you insist upon complete explanation before taking another faithful step, you may remain emotionally attached to a chapter God is inviting you to finish. Michael moves closer, and his message becomes gentler without losing authority. You do not have to carry resentment as proof that you learned your lesson. You do not have to carry anxiety as proof that you are being careful. You do not have to carry shame as punishment for choices you regret. Repent where repentance is needed. Make amends where appropriate. Learn what must be learned, but then allow grace to accomplish what endless self-condemnation never can. The person approaching this door does not need to be flawless. You need to be willing, awake, humble, and honest. Perhaps this is why the opening seemed delayed. You kept asking God to change your environment while God was revealing what needed attention within your heart. Not because every delay was divinely caused, and not because suffering should be romanticized, but because even difficult seasons can become places of transformation when surrendered to God. The pain did not have to be good for God to bring something good from it. The rejection did not have to be deserved for wisdom to emerge from it. What hurt you does not receive the final word over who you become. Now the narrator watches you loosen your grip. You release the need to prove yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You release the fantasy that one opportunity will solve every problem. You release the belief that another person's approval determines whether you are worthy. And suddenly your hands are open. That matters, because closed fists cannot receive easily. Michael steps aside. The threshold is visible again. But before you move, he gives one final instruction. Do not run backward to retrieve what God gave you strength to release. The familiar will sometimes call louder when the unfamiliar begins opening. Do not confuse familiarity with destiny. Walk toward the light with discernment. Carry the lessons but leave the chains. And as August 23rd draws closer in this prophetic narrative, the next revelation concerns the subtle signs of movement you may have overlooked. The door does not always swing open dramatically. Sometimes the first evidence is a quiet shift, a conversation, a realization, or a peace you cannot explain. Michael's next message is about recognizing movement without manufacturing signs. Type "I release what cannot come" with me in the comments if you receive this message. Blessing number 5252. May it remind you to enter every new season with open hands, clear discernment, and a heart anchored in God. The narrator sees Archangel Michael standing silently beside the threshold, and this time he is not watching the door. He's watching you, because there is something you need to understand before August 23rd arrives. When movement begins, it may not look dramatic. You have imagined the breakthrough as something impossible to miss, something accompanied by unmistakable confirmation, immediate answers, and sudden transformation. But Michael draws your attention towards something smaller. A thin line of light has appeared beneath the door. The door has not swung open yet, but the darkness around it is no longer complete. And his message is simple. Do not become so obsessed with the dramatic answer that you overlook the quiet beginning. Think about how many important changes in your life began almost invisibly. A conversation that seemed ordinary later became significant. A decision that felt small redirected an entire season. A moment of courage lasted only seconds but changed what you tolerated afterward. A person entered your life without fanfare and eventually became important. Sometimes transformation announces itself with thunder, but sometimes it begins as a whisper. This is why you must remain attentive without becoming anxious. There is a difference between spiritual awareness and searching desperately for signs. Awareness is peaceful. Obsession is exhausting. Discernment observes carefully. Fear interprets everything urgently. Michael is calling you toward discernment. As August 23rd approaches in this message, do not wake up believing every phone notification must contain a divine answer. Do not turn every number, coincidence, or unexpected interruption into a prophecy. Instead, watch what is genuinely changing. Perhaps clarity arrives concerning something that confused you for months. Perhaps courage rises where hesitation previously lived. Perhaps a conversation creates an opportunity you had not considered. Perhaps you finally recognize that the door you were knocking on was connected to another door entirely. Or perhaps the first movement is internal. You wake with peace about something that once controlled your thoughts. The narrator sees Michael pointing toward your heart because that may be where the earliest evidence appears. You expected circumstances to change first, but sometimes perspective changes before circumstances do. Suddenly, you no longer feel compelled to chase someone who repeatedly withdraws. Suddenly, an opportunity you once idolized loses its power over you. Suddenly, you can imagine another future. Do not underestimate that shift. Freedom often begins before circumstances catch up with it. A person can still be standing in the hallway while already becoming emotionally free from the door. Zechariah 4:10 asks, who dares despise the day of small things? That question belongs here. The small beginning may not satisfy the part of you that wants immediate proof, but small does not mean insignificant. A seed is small. A key is small. A hinge is small. Yet each can participate in something far larger than itself. If August 23rd brings one clear realization rather than an entire transformed life, receive the realization. If it brings one honest conversation rather than complete resolution, honor the conversation. If it brings courage to take one responsible step, take that step. Michael's warning now becomes sharper. Do not force the door simply because you have become excited about movement. There is a temptation after prolonged waiting to rush when the first possibility appears. You waited so long that you may want to say yes before asking whether yes is wise. But preparation has taught you better. Pray before committing. Read what needs to be read. Ask questions. Seek trustworthy counsel when necessary. Pay attention to character, consequences, and peace. Faith is not recklessness. An open opportunity does not remove the responsibility to exercise wisdom. The narrator now hears the clock again. 30 minutes. But the sound no longer creates fear. It creates focus. 30 minutes becomes a symbol of how quickly a meaningful opportunity can appear after a long period of apparent stillness. You can wait for years and then encounter a conversation that requires an answer within minutes. You can spend months preparing and suddenly find yourself standing before the possibility you once prayed about. This is why the hallway mattered. The waiting taught you how to remain steady when movement finally comes. And there is another small sign Michael wants you to notice: peace. Not excitement alone, because excitement can accompany both wisdom and foolishness. Not fearlessness, because courageous decisions can still make you nervous. But a deeper steadiness that allows you to think clearly. Philippians 4 speaks of the peace of God guarding hearts and minds. That peace does not guarantee a specific outcome, but it can protect you from allowing panic to become your guide. The narrator watches as your hand approaches the handle again. This time you do not pull. You listen. You observe. You pray. Something inside the mechanism shifts, quietly enough that the impatient version of you might have missed it. Live. There it is again. Fluent. Do not manufacture it. Do not exaggerate it. Do not fear it. Recognize what is real, respond wisely, and remain anchored in God. Because the next challenge may arrive precisely when movement becomes visible. After waiting this long, discouragement may whisper one final command: walk away. And Section 7 reveals why the temptation to quit can become strongest just before you finally have reason to keep going. Type "I will recognize the small beginning" in the comments if you receive this message. Blessing number 6363. May it remind you to remain attentive, discerning, patient, and peaceful as you watch for the next faithful step. The narrator sees Archangel Michael standing beside you again, but now his attention is fixed on the moment when you almost walked away. You remember that moment. Perhaps nobody else knows how close you came to giving up. You had knocked so many times that hope itself started feeling exhausting. You were tired of encouraging yourself. Tired of saying, maybe tomorrow. Tired of watching the same door remain silent while life seemed to move forward for everyone except you. And somewhere between another disappointment and another unanswered question, a thought entered your mind: maybe I should stop knocking. Michael brings that moment back into view because there is something you need to recognize. The greatest battle was not always about keeping the door closed. Sometimes the battle was about convincing you that there was no reason to remain hopeful. Discouragement rarely arrives announcing itself as defeat. Sometimes it sounds reasonable. It says, protect yourself. It says, stop expecting anything. It says, nothing has changed before, so nothing will change now. And after enough disappointment, those sentences begin sounding like wisdom. But Michael raises his sword of discernment between your past disappointment and your future possibility. Yesterday's closed door cannot automatically predict tomorrow's outcome. What happened before deserves to teach you, but it does not deserve unlimited authority over what you believe is possible. The narrator sees the hallway behind you stretching farther than you remembered. There are places along that hallway where you sat down because you had no strength to continue. There are places where you questioned your prayers. There are places where you watched another person receive the opportunity you wanted and quietly wondered whether God had overlooked your name. Yet look at where you are now. You survived those moments. You continue. Sometimes courage looked powerful, but sometimes courage looked like simply getting through another ordinary day without surrendering your heart completely to bitterness. This is where Galatians 6:9 speaks directly into the atmosphere. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Notice the verse acknowledges weariness. Scripture does not pretend faithful people never become tired. Weariness is real. Disappointment is real. Waiting can hurt. But exhaustion does not have to become your final decision. You can rest without quitting. You can admit that waiting hurts without declaring that hope is foolish. You can pause without walking permanently away from everything God is still teaching you. Michael now reveals another danger. When people become tired of waiting for the right door, they often become vulnerable to the wrong one. Suddenly, anything that opens looks attractive. Any attention feels like love. Any opportunity feels like destiny. Any shortcut feels like an answer. That is why your endurance requires discernment, not desperation. You are not being told to stand endlessly before something destructive. You are not being told to tolerate mistreatment or ignore reality. The deeper call is to refuse to let disappointment pressure you into choices that contradict wisdom simply because you are tired of waiting. The narrator watches Michael place himself between you, and several doors that appeared along the hallway. Some glittered. Some opened quickly. Some seemed easier than the door you had prayed about. Yet something within you hesitated. At the time, you called that hesitation frustration. Now you may recognize that some opportunities were simply not right for you. Not every closed path was an attack, and not every open path was a blessing. The waiting taught you the difference between movement and meaningful movement. Now the clock returns. 30 minutes. The urgency feels stronger, but Michael does not tell you to panic. He tells you to remain awake, because the temptation to abandon hope can become strongest when you have no evidence that circumstances are about to change. You cannot always know when a turning point is close. That is why your faith cannot depend entirely upon predicting timing. Your task is not to control the clock. Your task is to remain grounded enough that whether the answer arrives today, tomorrow, or differently than expected, disappointment does not separate you from God. And then the narrator sees something remarkable. Your hand is no longer pounding against the door. It rests calmly against it. You have learned the difference between persistence and panic. You no longer need to scream to prove that your prayer matters. You no longer need to force the mechanism. You can stand, listen, pray, and respond when movement comes. Michael turns toward you with one final warning before the threshold. Do not let fear become the baggage you carry through an opening you spent years praying to see. You survived the hallway, but survival habits cannot govern the next room. The door is moving, and Section 8 will reveal what must happen at the threshold before you take that first courageous step forward. Type "I will not quit" in discouragement in the comments if you receive this message. Blessing number 7474. May it remind you that endurance is not panic, faith is not recklessness, and hope can remain steady even while you wait. The narrator sees Archangel Michael standing directly at the threshold now, and the door is no longer completely closed. Light pours through the narrow opening, touching the floor where you have waited for what felt like an eternity. You expected this moment to bring nothing but excitement, yet something unexpected rises inside you: fear. After praying so long for movement, you suddenly realize that an open door requires something a closed door never demanded from you. It requires you to move. Waiting became familiar. The hallway became uncomfortable but predictable. Now the possibility of change stands before you, and Michael delivers an urgent message. Do not allow the fear you developed in the hallway to become the voice that leads you through the doorway. You know this fear. It asks what happens if you try again and fail again. It reminds you of the last opportunity that disappeared. It brings old rejection into new possibilities and whispers that history is preparing to repeat itself. You wanted the door open, but part of you became comfortable expecting it to remain closed because disappointment feels less dangerous when you anticipate it. Michael recognizes this conflict. His sword is raised, not against you, but symbolically against the lies that have attached themselves to your waiting. You are not being asked to forget what happened. You are being called to stop treating every new opportunity as though it has already committed yesterday's offense. This is where the threshold becomes sacred. Behind you is the person who learned to survive uncertainty. Ahead of you is the possibility of becoming someone who can move with faith despite uncertainty. Courage does not require the disappearance of every nervous thought. Courage means fear no longer receives the deciding vote. Joshua 1:9 declares, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." The promise was not that every road would become easy. The promise was presence. That is what Michael directs your attention toward now. The narrator watches you place one hand against the door. You are tempted to demand certainty before moving. You want guarantees. You want to know how everything will unfold after the first step. But faith rarely provides the entire map before asking for movement. Abraham went without knowing every detail of where he was going. Israel approached the waters before seeing the entire journey ahead. Peter stepped from the boat before knowing how long he could remain above the waves. Again and again, Scripture presents faith not as possession of complete information, but as trust sufficient for the next faithful step. Michael now turns your attention toward the light crossing the threshold. You do not need to see the entire room yet. You need enough light for the next step. A distinction can free you from enormous pressure. You do not need to solve the next 5 years tonight. You do not need to know how every relationship will unfold, how every opportunity will develop, or how every unanswered question will resolve. You need wisdom for what is actually before you. Tomorrow will require tomorrow's grace. Today requires today's obedience. And this is why the 30-minute message becomes especially important here. It is not a countdown threatening that heaven will abandon you. It is a symbol of decision. There are moments when excessive hesitation becomes another form of hiding. You can analyze an opportunity until fear disguises itself as caution. You can pray for direction and then refuse to move when responsible direction becomes clear. Michael's message is not rush. His message is do not let fear make the decision that wisdom should make. The narrator sees the threshold widening. You breathe differently now. You remember that the God who sustained you in the hallway does not disappear at the doorway. The same grace that carried you through rejection can carry you through responsibility. The same wisdom developed during delay can guide you through opportunity. The same God you trusted when nothing moved remains God when everything begins moving. So leave fear where it belongs. Leave behind the belief that one mistake will destroy everything. Leave behind the assumption that every blessing must eventually become another disappointment. Pray deeply but walk. Seek wisdom but walk. You have spent enough time believing courage means feeling nothing. Courage means feeling the weight of the threshold and still choosing the faithful step. Michael now stands beside the opening rather than blocking it. Beyond him, the room looks different from what you imagined. And that is the next revelation. The answer may arrive in a form you never expected. The door can truly open while still looking completely different from the picture you carried through the hallway. Type "I will walk forward in faith" in the comments if you receive this message. Blessing number 8585. May it remind you to cross every worthy threshold with courage, discernment, and peace. And as this door opens before you, remember that your light can help another person find courage at their own threshold. A seed placed into good soil can become shelter for someone you may never meet, and your generosity can help carry God-centered encouragement to a soul still waiting in darkness. Scripture teaches that God loves a cheerful giver, so let giving rise from willingness rather than pressure. Let your heart declare, "I will help carry hope through another person's door." The PayPal donation link is available in every video description, and the PayPal QR code remains in the bottom right corner of every video for those who freely choose to support this mission. May every willing gift become a seed of compassion, and may God grant each giver wisdom, provision, and peace according to His will. If your heart is moved, act with generosity and help this message of faith reach the next person standing at the threshold. The narrator sees Archangel Michael standing beside the opening now, and finally you can see beyond the threshold. But something about the view surprises you. This is not exactly what you pictured. During all those months of knocking, you created an image in your mind of what the answer should look like. You imagined the person, the opportunity, the timing, the conversation, perhaps even the exact circumstances surrounding your breakthrough. You prayed for the door to open, but somewhere along the way you also decided what had to be waiting behind it. Now Michael delivers a message that may determine whether you recognize what is actually arriving. Do not reject an answer simply because it enters your life wearing different clothes than your expectation. This is where discernment becomes essential. Sometimes people become so attached to the picture they created during the waiting season that they cannot recognize a meaningful opportunity when it appears differently. You expected a dramatic invitation, but perhaps the beginning comes through an ordinary conversation. You expected restoration of something old, but perhaps what develops is the courage to begin something new. You expected one particular person to finally recognize your value, but perhaps freedom arrives when you realize you no longer need that recognition. You expected the breakthrough to change everything around you immediately, yet perhaps its first work is changing something inside you. The narrator watches your expression as this realization settles. You almost say, "But this is not what I asked for." Michael does not dismiss the disappointment. Desire is real. You are allowed to acknowledge when reality differs from what you hoped would happen. Yet you must also leave room for the possibility that your understanding was incomplete. Isaiah 55 reminds believers that God's thoughts and ways exceed human thoughts and ways. That does not mean every unexpected circumstance is automatically divine. It means humility leaves room for God to lead differently than you predicted. Consider how often Scripture presents answers that arrive unexpectedly. David was a shepherd when Samuel came looking for a king. Bethlehem seemed an unlikely setting for the birth of Christ. The disciples expected power to look one way, yet Jesus repeatedly revealed a kingdom shaped by service, humility, sacrifice, and love. God's work does not always conform to human expectations. Sometimes the very thing that makes an opportunity easy to overlook is the simplicity of its beginning. Michael now points toward the doorway, and the narrator notices something else. There are no flashing signs beyond it. No guarantee is written across the wall. There is simply enough light to examine what is actually there. This is important because faith does not require you to abandon wisdom. Test what appears. Ask whether it aligns with truth. Examine character. Consider consequences. Pray. Seek wise counsel when the decision carries serious weight. The fact that you have been waiting does not mean you must accept the first thing that resembles an answer. But do not make the opposite mistake either. Do not demand perfection from the beginning. Some opportunities arrive as seeds rather than finished harvests. A new direction may begin with learning. A restored relationship may begin with one honest conversation rather than instant trust. A financial opportunity may begin with responsible work rather than sudden abundance. Healing may begin with the courage to ask for help. Purpose may begin with one small act of obedience nobody applauds. You asked for the finished picture, but God may place a seed in your hand and ask whether you recognize its potential. The narrator now hears the clock begin. 30 minutes. Yet you understand its meaning differently. The urgency is not forcing you to see something blindly. It is reminding you not to remain trapped inside an outdated expectation when wisdom is inviting you to look again. Some moments require thoughtful decisions. Some doors remain open long enough for careful consideration. Others require timely courage. Your task is not to become frantic. Your task is to become present. Michael turns toward the version of you who first entered the hallway. That person wanted one specific outcome because they believed happiness depended upon it. But you have changed. You now understand that God can create pathways you did not know existed. You understand that losing one possibility does not mean losing your future. You understand that a closed door can redirect your attention without defining your worth. And because you learned these things, you can approach what opens with curiosity instead of desperation. Then comes the question Michael has been preparing you to answer. If the door opens differently than expected, will you recognize substance beneath unfamiliar appearance? Will you examine it carefully without immediately dismissing it? Will you allow God to surprise you without surrendering discernment? The narrator watches as you move closer. The threshold is no longer theoretical. Something is asking for a response. Soon, observing will no longer be enough. There comes a moment when preparation must become movement, when prayer must produce responsible action, and when standing at the threshold becomes another form of delay. That is what comes next. The door may be open, but you still have to decide whether you will walk. Type "I am open to God's direction" in the comments if you receive this message. Blessing number 9696. May it remind you to recognize new beginnings with humility, wisdom, discernment, and courageous faith. The narrator sees Archangel Michael standing beside the open doorway, and now there is nowhere left for the question to hide. You prayed for this. You waited for this. You imagined what it would feel like when resistance finally gave way and the threshold appeared before you. Yet now that the door is open, your feet remain planted exactly where they were. This is the strange truth about breakthrough that few people discuss. Sometimes waiting becomes so familiar that movement feels more frightening than delay. You spent so much time asking God to open the door that you never considered what would be required when the answer became, "Now walk." Michael looks toward the light beyond the threshold and then toward you. His message carries authority. You cannot enter a new season while continually asking yesterday for permission to leave. For months, perhaps years, your spiritual posture was built around waiting. You learned patience. You learned endurance. You learned how to remain faithful when nothing seemed to change. Those lessons mattered. But there comes a moment when the lesson changes. Yesterday required patience. Today may require courage. Yesterday required you to remain still. Tomorrow may require movement. The danger is assuming that because waiting was faithful in one season, waiting must remain faithful forever. Sometimes the very prayer you have repeated becomes the instruction you must finally obey. You asked for direction. Direction appears. You asked for opportunity. Opportunity appears. Then fear whispers, "Wait for another confirmation." The narrator sees you looking backward down the hallway. Every disappointment is still visible there. You remember the door that opened briefly and closed again. You remember trusting someone who disappointed you. You remember taking a risk that did not produce what you expected. Those memories begin presenting arguments against movement. But Michael raises the sword of discernment once more. Your history deserves to inform you, but it cannot be permitted to imprison you. Wisdom says, learn from what happened. Fear says, because something hurt once, never move again. Those voices can sound similar until you examine what they produce. Wisdom produces careful courage. Fear produces paralysis. This is where the biblical image of Israel standing before the Red Sea becomes powerful. There was a moment for crying out, but there was also a moment when God told Moses to tell the people to move forward. The path was not useful merely because it existed. They had to enter it. In the same way, an opportunity can appear without transforming your life if you refuse every responsible action connected to it. A conversation still requires honesty. A calling still requires discipline. A new beginning still requires choices. An open door is not the end of participation. Often it is where participation becomes most necessary. Michael now points toward your feet. One step. Not 20. Not the entire journey at once. One faithful step. Perhaps that means making the call you have responsibly delayed. Perhaps it means submitting the application after months of believing you are unqualified. Perhaps it means beginning the work rather than endlessly planning it. Perhaps it means accepting that a previous chapter has ended and allowing yourself to build again. Whatever the specific situation, courage usually becomes manageable when you stop demanding strength for the entire journey and ask God for strength for the next faithful action. The 30-minute urgency returns here with greater clarity. It is not a supernatural deadline after which God withdraws his love. It is a symbol reminding you that opportunities deserve attention. There are moments when hesitation protects you, and there are moments when hesitation becomes avoidance. Discernment must tell you which moment you are in. Do not rush into financial commitments, relationships, contracts, or major decisions simply because a message made you emotional. Pray. Verify. Think. Seek appropriate counsel. But once wisdom becomes clear, do not endlessly invent new reasons to remain frozen. The narrator now watches you lift one foot. Something changes immediately. The hallway does not disappear, but it loses authority. At first, movement becomes a declaration. My past taught me, but it does not own me. You are not walking because every question has been answered. You are walking because enough has become clear for the next step. This is what mature faith can look like, not reckless certainty, but courageous obedience combined with humility. Michael moves through the doorway ahead of you in the narrator's vision, symbolizing protection and courage rather than a guarantee that the road beyond will contain no difficulty. Divine protection does not mean a life without challenges. It means fear does not have to rule the journey. Psalm 121 declares that the Lord watches over your coming and going. Carry that assurance, not the illusion, that faith eliminates every obstacle. Now your foot crosses the threshold. The door you once stared at from a distance is behind you. And suddenly you understand something you could never understand while waiting. The hallway was not merely keeping you from the next room. It was shaping the person who would eventually enter it. That revelation leads directly into section 11. Because before this story reaches its final opening, Michael will show you who you became while you thought nothing was happening. Type "I will take the next faithful step" in the comments if you receive this message. Blessing number 1010. May it remind you to move with courage, wisdom, patience, and faith when the right door opens. The narrator sees Archangel Michael standing just beyond the threshold, but instead of urging you farther into the new room, he turns you around. For one final moment, you are asked to look back at the hallway. Something is different now. From the side of the door, the distance appears greater than you remembered. You see the places where you nearly surrendered. You see the nights when uncertainty became overwhelming. You see the prayers spoken with confidence and the prayers whispered through exhaustion. And Michael directs your attention toward a revelation you could not understand while you were still waiting. The person who first knocked on that door is not the same person standing here now. You thought the entire story was about getting the door to open. But part of the story was about what the waiting was building within you. When you first arrived, you wanted immediate answers. You believed speed meant favor, and delay meant something had been wrong. You watched other people advance and measured your life against their timelines. Their victories became evidence against your own future. But the hallway confronted that comparison. Slowly, painfully, you learned that another person's open door does not mean yours has been forgotten. Their season does not define yours. Their pace does not determine your worth. You learn to celebrate another person without interpreting their blessing as your rejection. That lesson alone changed something important within you. Michael points toward another place in the hallway. That was where rejection wounded you. You remember how personally you took it. One person's no became a verdict against your identity. One failed opportunity became evidence that perhaps you were incapable. But you kept living. You kept learning. Eventually, you discovered that rejection could hurt without defining you. You learned to ask better questions. Was the opportunity actually right? Were you truly prepared? Was there something to improve? Was the rejection simply another person's decision rather than declaration over your future? Discernment began replacing self-condemnation. The narrator now sees the places where your plans collapsed. Not every collapse was divinely orchestrated, and not every painful event needs to be called a blessing. Some things simply hurt. Some choices had consequences. Some people disappointed you. Some circumstances were unfair. Yet God was still able to meet you there. That distinction matters. You do not need to pretend pain was pleasant in order to believe redemption is possible. Romans 5 speaks about suffering producing perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. The wound itself is not the treasure. What God can form through faithful endurance is where transformation becomes visible. Look at your prayers now. They have changed him. Once you prayed mainly, God, open this door. Then your prayer became, God, show me whether this is the right door. Later it became, God, prepare me for whatever you know is right. That progression reveals maturity. You moved from demanding one outcome toward seeking wisdom. You stopped assuming that every desire needed immediate fulfillment. You began wanting peace more than appearances, integrity more than applause, and purpose more than recognition. Michael now draws attention to your hands. They are no longer clenched around the handle. That may be one of the clearest signs of growth. You still care about what happens, but you no longer believe your entire identity depends upon it. You can desire something deeply without worshiping the outcome. You can work diligently without believing success determines whether your life has value. You can hope boldly while remaining surrendered. That is strength the hallway could not give you quickly. It had to be practiced. The narrator sees another version of you sitting against the wall somewhere in the past, exhausted and asking whether continuing was worth it. You wish you could return to that person for 30 seconds. What would you say? Perhaps you would not promise that everything would happen exactly as imagined. Perhaps you would simply say, keep becoming, keep praying, keep learning. This season will not always feel like this. Sometimes hope does not need detailed predictions. Sometimes it needs enough light for another step. Now Michael turns toward the open space ahead. The 30-minute countdown has almost completed its symbolic purpose. It was never meant to terrorize you. It was meant to awaken you to the preciousness of response. Time matters because life moves. Opportunities change. People grow. Seasons end. And when wisdom makes the next step clear, endless hesitation can become another way of refusing growth. You are standing here carrying something far more valuable than the person who first knocked possessed. You carry discernment developed through disappointment. You carry patience forged through uncertainty. You carry boundaries learned through experience. You carry compassion because you now understand what waiting feels like. You carry humility because you discovered that you cannot control every outcome. And now the narrator understands why Michael wanted you to look backward before moving forward. You are not being invited to glorify the hallway. You are being invited to recognize that it did not destroy you. The final threshold is ahead. Section 12 will bring the door fully open and reveal the final message, how to enter the new season without forgetting the God who sustained you while it was still closed. Type I am ready to walk forward in the comments if you receive this message. Blessing number 1111. May it remind you that growth formed in hidden seasons can become courage when the next door finally opens. The narrator sees the final 30 minutes reaching their symbolic end, and now the sound you have waited for finally comes. The hinges move. The resistance gives way. The door that once seemed permanently sealed begins to open. Light crosses the threshold and falls across the same ground where you once stood wondering whether anything would ever change. Archangel Michael remains beside you, but his final message is not about rushing forward. It is about remembering who carried you while the door was closed. Because an opportunity can change your circumstances, but gratitude must guard your heart when circumstances change. You prayed when nobody saw you. You remained when leaving would have been easier. Now, as the narrator watches the threshold widen, Michael declares, "Enter awake. Enter humble. Enter remembering God." August 23rd has carried you through the image of a countdown. But understand what those 30 minutes were truly meant to awaken. They were never a threat that God would abandon you when a clock reached zero. They were a reminder that seasons change and that spiritual opportunities should not be slept through. There are moments for waiting, moments for preparation, and moments for responsible movement. You have been through the waiting. You have faced the preparation. Now, when a worthy door genuinely opens, you must recognize that gratitude and discernment belong on the other side just as much as they belonged in the hallway. The narrator sees you taking another step, and immediately an old temptation appears. You want to look backward and prove something to everyone who doubted you. You want those who rejected you to witness where you are going. But Michael stops that thought before it becomes your motivation. Do not turn your blessing into revenge. Do not make your next chapter a performance for people from the previous one. If God gives you greater responsibility, carry it with greater humility. If He gives you influence, use it to serve. If He gives you resources, become generous. If He gives you restoration, become compassionate. The purpose of an open door is not to make you superior to those standing outside it. And now the narrator notices that the room beyond the threshold is larger than expected. There are possibilities here you could not see from the hallway. That is why you must remain awake. An open door is not permission to abandon discernment. Continue praying. Continue examining your decisions. Continue asking whether your actions align with truth, wisdom, integrity, and love. You did not survive the hallway merely to become careless once circumstances improved. The same spiritual attentiveness that helped you endure the waiting must now help you steward what comes next. Michael's presence in this prophetic image becomes a symbol of protection and courage. Psalm 91 speaks of God commanding His angels concerning His people, and Psalm 121 declares that the Lord watches over their coming and going. Carry that biblical assurance without demanding a life free from difficulty. Protection does not mean nothing challenging will ever happen. Faith does not mean every decision automatically succeeds. It means you do not have to walk through uncertainty believing you are abandoned. Then something remarkable happens. The narrator looks backward once more, but the hallway no longer looks like a place of punishment. It looks like evidence. You remember the person who almost quit there. You remember the prayers spoken there. You remember learning boundaries there. You remember discovering that your worth did not depend upon one door. Suddenly, you realize the breakthrough was never merely about reaching another room. Something had already opened within you before the external door moved. That is the final revelation. You were asking, when will the door open? But heaven was also asking, who will you become when it does? Now you have your answer. You will enter grateful. You will enter discerning. You will enter without dragging bitterness across the threshold. You will enter without worshiping the opportunity. You will enter remembering that the God who was worthy of your trust in the hallway remains worthy when the room is filled with light. The narrator sees Michael standing at the threshold one final time. Behind him is the season that shaped you. Ahead is a future you cannot completely predict. And above both stands the truth of Proverbs 3:5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Acknowledge him in your ways, and allow him to direct your path. So walk, not because a date guarantees a miracle. Walk because fear does not deserve permanent authority over you. Walk because wisdom hath been formed in you. Walk because another closed door does not have to define your identity. Walk because when God provides a faithful next step, courage answers. The door is open. The hallway is behind you. And the next chapter begins with one step. Type "I am walking through the open door" in the comments if you receive this message. Blessing number 1212. May it remind you to walk forward covered in prayer, grounded in wisdom, overflowing with gratitude, and anchored in God. And now that you have reached the open door, remember that someone else is still standing in a hallway praying for one ray of hope to reach them. When you freely support this mission, you help carry God-centered encouragement beyond this threshold and toward another soul who may desperately need to hear that their story is not finished. Scripture reminds us that whoever sows generously can reap generously. So let every gift become a seed planted with love rather than pressure. Let your heart declare, "I will help carry this light to someone still waiting." The PayPal donation link is available in every video description, and the PayPal QR code is displayed in the bottom right corner of every video for those who genuinely desire to give. May God bless every willing giver with wisdom in their finances, peace in their heart, and grace to remain generous according to what they can responsibly give. If you feel called to support this work, give freely and help carry the message of faith through the next door.